Welcome back to Big Mouth. I found this really interesting article about Cathy Yan from Geeks Vibes Nation. So let's read it because this is very interesting. Now, I've spoken about how I feel Birds of Prey went wrong and who was really in control of this movie and who's to blame for this movie. And I've always been out and proud about this. If you're not a fan of Birds of Prey and you're a Birds of Prey fan and you're angry that this film isn't what you wanted it to be, Margot Robbie is completely to blame. Not Cathy Yan and not the studio. Anyway, let's read this. Birds of Prey's Cathy Yan talks not having more control over film. It seems to be a trend for directors who have directed DC Warner Brothers films feel as if they didn't have the freedom they would have liked. Right, first of all, it's not just something that happens at DC and Warner Brothers. How much freedom do you think the directors on Marvel TV shows and movies have? Very little. But they understand that at the outset. And these are people who maybe don't have a big CV and are just happy to be there and, be part of Kevin Feige's greater vision. Anyway, we've seen David Ayer express this over Suicide Squad, and Zack Snyder had a whole movement due to expressing how different his vision for Justice League was from what Warner Brothers put out. Now, again, Zack Snyder and David Ayer come from the independent movie game, right? They're not mainstream directors, so they are used to getting what they want and having their visions up on the screen, up in the final cut. This is why it became more problematic for them than for other directors. So it should come as no surprise that Cathy Yan follows the same sentiment. The director of Birds of Prey, which came out in 2020 and garnered mixed reactions, expresses she would have liked more control over the film. And, what director wouldn't want more control over the film, over their own film? But nobody who makes films in the mainstream movie industry, where you're given hundreds of millions of pounds by these studios, is going to get 100% freedom. It just doesn't happen. That should never happen. Right, anyway. It was definitely challenging. Dead Pigs was such a singular, pure version of myself. And I think when you're dealing with a budget like Birds of Prey had, and the sort of pressures of a studio, especially a studio that is undergoing a lot of change, inevitably you end up having to compromise and fight for stuff. And you win some, and you lose a lot. It's just kind of how it is. I would have loved to have more control over the edit of Birds of Prey, she continued. But that's just kind of how it is. I don't know if there's a Cathy Yan cut out there, but I think for any filmmaker, all of us are in it because we want to express ourselves as wholly as possible and to match what you ultimately see on screen with what's in our head. So now we have to discuss why she wasn't in charge of the editing completely and the editing was left to the studio. Well, this is simple. Because Margot Robbie was in charge of the film. She was in charge of how it was written, what kind of context it was going to be written in, and what the narrative was done in. And I'm sure Cathy Yan and Margot Robbie maybe were on the same page, although I don't see them tagging each other and telling the world how much they're in love with each other and proud of the film that they made, right? That's interesting. And so I don't think that Margot Robbie and Cathy Yan are close friends or happy with each other or happy how things ended up in the end. The reason the studio got involved is because they didn't like the movie Cathy and Margot wanted to make, and they did make that movie. So in the editing bay, they decided to take control because they believed the movie they were going to put out there simply would have been a flop. This made a small profit. I believe this film would have been even more politically triggering with the kind of SJW kind of narrative they already put across in this film, right? That was bad enough. I think if the studio didn't get involved, it would have created a bigger problem, a much bigger problem. So I think the studio had to get involved. Don't forget, they brought in Chad, the director of John Wick, to do the action as well, because she in the end was incapable of shooting good, stunning action sequences, right? So he had to come in and rush out his own. And his action sequences weren't great. They were an improvement, I'm sure, on what she did. He just didn't have the time to, provide, really good polished action sequences because of the schedule. And this is why they got in her way, and this is why she didn't have the freedom. And I would think it's a cold day in hell before Warner Brothers ever allow the Yang cut to come out. Yan then commented on Air's cut of Suicide Squad, which is trying to get the same traction the release the Snyder Cut got. I do know that there was a very different tone of a movie that Air had planned for Suicide Squad that never really made it, Yan said. And so if he gets to show his cut or get to take another stab at it, then that's an insanely wonderful opportunity. Yan then commented in response to how directing Birds of Prey affected her mindset about big-budget blockbuster films. Yes and no, I never did Birds of Prey in the first place so that I could say I did a big movie or blockbuster movie. I actually very much did it because I thought the script was interesting, and the fact I got a chance to depict women, especially female superheroes, in a way that we haven't really seen before. Exactly, that's part of the problem, Kathy. Like neither perfect nor weak, you know. I think it's typically either or, really. I enjoyed that challenge of being able to subvert the genre a little bit. Oh, wow. She continues. I would subvert. They love that word subvert. And when you hear that word subvert, and when a director's subverting your expectations, you know the film's going to be in trouble. I would not discount ever doing it again. Will you ever get the opportunity to do it again? I try not to think of whether I would do this type of movie or that type of movie again, or whether I'd work with this studio or that. But more like, is this story compelling? And I'm also a writer-director, so in that case, my big lesson is that I want to continue to do that and have a little bit more control over the story I'm telling. And the only way you're going to do that is to make smaller independent movies, Kathy. Because what you did with Birds of Prey, I don't think even a small kind of studio would have allowed you to get away with that. What do you think about blah, blah, blah? Yeah, well, I'm going to tell everyone right now what I think of this. Basically, there's never going to be a Kathy Yan cut. There is a Kathy Yan cut. Listen, every director has a director's cut. Bryan Singer has a cut of Superman Returns where we actually get to see the Return to Krypton sequence pre-credit, right? Pre-starting credits, right? And there's an expansive film there. I'd like to see that. That's a cut I'd like to see. I have no thoughts or feelings about a Yan cut, because it's just going to be even worse than what we saw. What we saw actually was a cleaned up movie. This is why the studio took over the editing. Let me be absolutely clear here, because Geeks Vibes Nation is putting across a similar situation to what David Ayer went through and Snyder went through. It is absolutely different, because what they were doing was to please the audience, their fans, the people who want to see their films, right? They were giving us something, right? And it was taken away because of the critics, because the mainstream weren't coming to the party. It was about business. But Kathy Yan's movie would have been, the Kathy Yan cut is a toxic cut. It's all about toxic masculinity. It's all about men taking credit for women's work. It's boring. It's not interesting. And I suppose feminists and all leftists want to see this film, but nobody else. And when she says subverting the comic book genre, this is all part of the problem. No one wants you to subvert. I think subverting expectations is great when you see a cliffhanger you didn't expect, that someone dies who you thought would never be killed off within a story, that there's a twist with character dynamics and storytelling. Subverting expectation in that way is great. But when you're purposely taking away something that people want and giving them something that they don't, and after all, we are paying for this, then you are destroying it. Kathy Yan was employed by Margot Robbie's production company, basically by Margot Robbie, because she's an Asian woman. So it was all about representation and inclusion, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think Kathy Yan is probably a very, very gifted, capable director who could have made an awesome, arse-kicking Birds of Prey movie. But that's not what she wanted to do, and that's not what Margot Robbie wanted to do. And as soon as it went to shit, I've never heard Margot Robbie, give Kathy Yan, oh, what a director. It was great working with her. I've never heard that. So now Yan has come out talking about Air because she's trying to align herself. She's trying to look like she's in the same boat. She was betrayed by the studio. She was betrayed by the studio, but she was also betrayed by Margot Robbie. Let's make this absolutely clear. the Yan cut isn't better than what we saw. It's 20 times worse. If you're someone who's triggered by the kind of political stuff, the alt-left stuff that she was doing in this film, I can absolutely promise you that the studio did you and me a favour. So this is all about failing upwards. This is about Cathy Yan saying, oh, if you didn't like the film, it's not my fault because I've got a nice, better cut out there. They're now going to try and use what Snyder went through and David Ayer went through to try and justify them not being very good at their jobs. But what do you think? Did you like Cathy Yan's Birds of Prey? Would you like to see a Yan cut? Comment down below, like, share and subscribe, and I'll be back later on with even more videos. See you again soon.